Well, this is the tunnel that Joaquin and Chapo Guzman came out of. We're gonna go down and take a closer look. Let's go check it out, guys.
Today, Joaquin El Chapo Guzman is rotting in the U.S.'s highest security prison, the Florence Supermax. After a long list of horrendous crimes, it's unlikely he will ever walk free again. But the Florence Supermax was not El Chapo's first prison. Indeed, Mexican authorities arrested him several times and he was incarcerated at 2 prisons in Mexico before 2016, but neither could keep the Sinaloa kingpin in. How did El Chapo escape prison twice before his final arrest? Let's dive in. Joaquin Archibaldo Guzman Lorera was born on April 4, 1957 in a very tiny village called La Tuna in the Sinaloa municipality in Mexico. As a teenager, he started working for El Padrino, the kingpin of the Guadalajara cartel. Back in the day, this was the one and only Mexican drug cartel. El Chapo and his buddy El Mayo seized the opportunity and slowly climbed the ranks with their proficient tunneling skills. This helped the Guadalajara cartel expand their smuggling routes and go undetected for years, but the tunneling skills would come in handy to El Chapo in other ways soon. In 1989, El Padrino was arrested, and the whole cartel crumbled into tinier factions: Juarez, Tijuana, and Sinaloa. The latter was founded by El Chapo and El Mayo. Within years, they raised it to Mexico's most powerful cartel. This title still stands today, even with El Chapo in prison. Before being sent to the ADX Florence in 2017, El Chapo was sent to prison in Mexico twice before, but as far as he was concerned, no prison cell could hold him in. In 1993, El Chapo was arrested in Guatemala for murder and drug trafficking. Indeed, El Chapo had been killing police officers, government officials, and civilians from the very beginning of his nasty cartel. This time, he'd been involved in killing Cardinal Posadas Ocampo, a huge figure of the Catholic Church in Mexico. Anyone who stood in his way to absolute power got a death warrant. So when Guatemalan authorities finally caught him, they extradited El Chapo to Mexico, where he was sentenced to 20 years in prison at La Palma and Juarez. Mexico's government actually thought this might be the end of the Sinaloa cartel, just like in the case of the Guadalajara, but they were very wrong. First of all, El Chapo was perfectly capable of conducting his business from prison via phone and visitors. Second of all, he had enough money and influence to ensure he had better conditions than his fellow inmates. Reportedly, he also had contraband smuggled into prison on a daily basis. Whatever he wanted to eat or smoke, he got. Then, 8 years into his sentence, El Chapo decided he had had enough. Well, there was a reason behind this. Around the turn of the century, El Chapo was indicted in San Diego on U.S. charges of money laundering and importing tons of white powder into California, along with his Sinaloa attorney, Humberto Loyo Castro, or Lawyer Perez, who was charged with bribing Mexican officials so that any cartel members arrested were released from custody. Then, a ruling by the Supreme Court of Mexico made extradition between Mexico and the United States easier. This meant that El Chapo could be sent to the United States, and he knew bribery wouldn't work as well there. So in his classic Sinaloa fashion, he bribed prison guards to ensure his escape. On January 19, 2001, a prison guard named Francisco El Chito Cambreros Rivera opened El Chapo's electronically operated cell door. Then El Chapo hopped into a laundry cart that maintenance worker Javier Cambreros rolled through several doors and eventually out the front door. Once outside, El Chapo moved into the trunk of a car driven by Javier out of town. When they stopped at a gas station, Javier went inside to pay, and when he came back, El Chapo was gone. He'd run away on foot. The numbers are pretty crazy. In El Chapo's first escape plan, there were 78 people involved, and El Chapo spent a total of $2.5 million split between these people. What do you mean, you might ask? You only mentioned a guard and a maintenance worker. Well, it turns out the police in Jalisco were also paid off to ensure El Chapo had at least 24 hours to get out of the state and stay ahead of the military manhunt. And the director of the prison facility was also made aware of the plan and paid not to interfere. El Chito is currently in prison for his assistance in the escape, and so is the facility's director. El Chapo didn't just plan his escape overnight. Over many years, he worked hard until all prison officials were in his pocket. There was one prison guard who was on the side of justice and reported the situation to his bosses. Sadly, he was disappeared 7 years later. Much like his Colombian counterpart Pablo Escobar, El Chapo lives by the saying plata o plomo, either be corrupt and accept my bribery or get killed for your righteousness. This meant that at any given time, the government was divided into people who wanted to catch El Chapo and people who wanted to protect him. El Chapo was on the run for 13 years, hiding in the Sierra Madre Mountains, living on the run, and always looking over his shoulder. However, that didn't stop him from murdering thousands of people. The police knew that, even on the run, most kingpins can't resist seeing their families. So, in February 2014, El Chapo and El Mayo were tracked down to a family reunion in Sinaloa. On February 22nd, the Mexican Navy raided a beach hotel in Mazatlan and arrested El Chapo. He was in a lavish room with his wife Emma Coronel and their twin daughters. El Chapo put up a fist fight but didn't attempt to shoot the officers. Even though he had a gun on him, he knew it would end badly, especially with his family there. This time he was transferred to the maximum security facility at La Palma, or Altiplano prison, in a Black Hawk helicopter. Here's an ironic twist. Hearing news of his second arrest, the American government insisted that El Chapo be extradited to the US so that he couldn't bribe his way out of prison again. But the Mexican government felt offended by this proposal. They responded by saying it would take hundreds of years before El Chapo would be extradited. The government felt insulted by the claim that the guards were bribable, even though that was exactly how El Chapo escaped the first time, and it would be the same way he'd escape a second time. The prison facility was much tougher than the first one, and El Chapo found he couldn't bribe everyone around him anymore. Inmates weren't allowed to interact with one another, and they weren't allowed to contact their family members either. El Chapo was allowed to receive visits from members of his family every 9 days with approval from a judge, and was granted by law the right to receive 638 pesos, that's about $48, every month to buy products for personal hygiene. He was in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, with just 1 hour outdoors. However, even outside, he was not allowed to play sports or talk to other prisoners. So El Chapo couldn't run his cartel from prison anymore. Again, to him, this meant he had to escape.
Well, this is the tunnel that Joaquin and Chapo Guzman came out of. We're gonna go down and take a closer look. Let's go check it out, guys. Yeah, this is maybe about 20 feet, 25 feet maybe.
On July 11, 2015, at 20:52, El Chapo disappeared from the security camera in his cell. This was surreal, but when the guards went to have a closer look, they understood how he disappeared. El Chapo had dug a tunnel starting in his shower and ended on a property miles away. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the property had been bought by El Chapo's wife, Emma Coronel. Imagine having to admit El Chapo escaped prison twice after you swore he wouldn't.
Como se informó la madrugada, el día de ayer, en el Centro Federal de Readaptación Social número 1, Altiplano, se registró la fuga de Joaquín Guzmán Loera, quien estaba ubicado en el área de tratamientos especiales, pasillo número 2, estancia número 20.
Clearly, the tunnel hadn't been built overnight, so someone was in El Chapo's pocket again. Needless to say, news of his second escape generated a pretty big scandal and further conflicts between Mexico and the United States.
Las instituciones del Estado mexicano, que en 15 meses lograron la detención de este criminal y de otros muchos más, son las mismas instituciones que están poniendo todo su empeño y capacidades para reprenderlo.
So authorities started looking into El Chapo's short stint at the Altiplano Maximum Security Facility. According to a former Altiplano prisoner, it was clear El Chapo had preferential treatment this time too.
Lo que me llama la atención es que el reo que dicen que es el Chapo tiene cabello. Todos los días tienes que afeitarte. Te rapan casi cada 20 días, 15 días. Ahí no se discute, ¿eh? Nadie discute nada. Son órdenes.
Yet somehow El Chapo managed to keep his hair and dig a mile-long tunnel outside the prison. Remember how tunneling got El Chapo a high position in the Guadalajara cartel? His tunnels created some of the most profitable drug trafficking routes in Mexico and into the United States, many of which are still being used today. El Chapo put his best skills to use inside his prison cell, but he didn't dig with his own hands.
Well, we're gonna get a first-hand look at the kind of tunnel that the Sinaloa cartel has become famous for constructing in their efforts to traffic drugs across the border. So I think it's safe to assume that this is the sort of tunnels that they use to cross drugs into the United States.
The tunnel was partially reinforced and had wooden planks as the ceiling. A lot of work went into making the tunnel, and clearly it went on for a long time.
This is sort of the lobby, if you will, to the tunnel. The dirt that we were just standing on is right above these wooden planks. So clearly you can see that this is a well-constructed facility. Essentially, there's a generator here beside me, and the actual tunnel down to the length, the mile-long tunnel is right here.
The craziest part? El Chapo even had a makeshift motorcycle fit inside the tunnel so he wouldn't have to walk the full mile.
As the government said, this motorcycle contraption-like thing, it's not actually a motorcycle, it's some kind of vehicle that is fitted also with these little carts that was probably used to move the dirt. Well, it's adapted. It doesn't have a front tire. It has a small energy source here. It can move forward and backward. Looks like a very old mining type vehicle.
It's pretty obvious some people were bribed here too. It's not like El Chapo did all of this himself with the strong security that the prison brags about. He had several people working for him and several prison guards protecting him and keeping his escape project a secret.
Me parece que es una burla a la sociedad el que nos los quieran presentar de esta manera, porque si no le abrieron la puerta, le abrieron un túnel. La principal responsabilidad es de Peña Nieto, de Osorio Chong, del secretario de Seguridad, de la Procuradora, de la Coordinadora General de los FRS. Ellos son los principales responsables.
As a consequence, the U.S. government became stronger in its support of his arrest and extradition. Similarly to Escobar's case, the DEA worked with the Mexican authorities to catch El Chapo for a third and final time. A huge manhunt started for El Chapo. Every border and airport was alerted so that he couldn't leave Mexico, and helicopters searched for him 24/7. In January 2016, El Chapo and his most trusted guard were tracked to a house in Los Mochis. When their house was raided on January 8th, they escaped through, guess what? A mile-long tunnel. Once outside, they stole a car at gunpoint. The federal police located the car a dozen miles south of Los Mochis. When El Chapo was stopped, he attempted to bribe the 4 officers. When they refused, he said, "You're all going to die." El Chapo was still confident he was in control, but after the officers contacted the feds, they learned that 40 sicarios were on their way to free El Chapo, so the police took El Chapo to a motel and called for reinforcements. During the raid, 5 gunmen were killed, 6 others arrested, and 1 Marine was wounded. The Mexican Navy said that they found 2 armored cars, 8 assault rifles, including 2 Beret M82 sniper rifles, 2 M16 rifles with grenade launchers, and a loaded rocket-propelled grenade launcher. This time, Mexico couldn't resist extradition anymore, and the fear on El Chapo's face when he landed in the U.S. was real. He knew his bribery and power games had come to an end. After a 2-year-long trial, he was found guilty of a very long list of charges: murder, money laundering, engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, drug manufacture, trafficking, using a firearm in furtherance of drug crimes, and the list goes on. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at the country's highest security federal prison, the ADX Florence in Colorado. A retired ADX prison guard commented, "For him to escape, he would have to have a warden in his pocket. It's a very controlled environment. No one moves there without permission at all. No 2 inmates move in the facility at the same time." El Chapo now spends 23 hours a day inside a soundproof cell. His only hour of spare time is thoroughly supervised, and if he goes outside, he is shackled around his waist, arms, and ankles. Needless to say, phones are also off the table. In fact, the only kind of technology available is a small black and white TV set in their cell, and inmates only receive this TV if they've demonstrated good behavior over a very long period of time. Here's what the warden said about the prison.
I don't know what hell is, but I do know that the assumption would be for a free person, would be pretty close to it.
There are several accounts of ADX Florence inmates screaming for hours or hurting themselves as they simply go mad inside their tiny cells. Some mutilate their bodies with razors, shards of glass, sharpened chicken bones, writing utensils, and whatever other objects they can attain. El Chapo might never leave this horror show. But according to DEA Special Agent Ray Donovan, his punishment makes a lot of sense. This is the kind of fate that a man responsible for unspeakable violence and death deserves. Thousands of people died or were ordered killed because of the Sinaloa cartel. So yeah, he doesn't leave his cell. It is boring, it's monotonous, and it's very sad, but here's the difference. He's alive, and that means he could do plenty of things, unlike many of his victims. As of 2023, El Chapo is fighting to be transferred to a prison in Mexico, arguing that the Florence Supermax is cruel and damaging his health. But what about all the people whose health he damaged? In other words, all the people he tortured, killed, or left without a family. And with his crazy escape record, it's unlikely El Chapo will ever get sent to Mexico again. Hey, thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on El Chapo's crazy escapes? Will he ever manage to leave the Florence Supermax? Let me know what you think in a comment, and before you go, make sure you like, subscribe, and click that bell button so you never miss a fresh episode. See you next time.